Green, and this is Shakespeare. Welcome to Crash Course.
And I'm John Brown.
Okay. Between 10 and 12 million slaves were forcibly taken from Africa over a period of 300 years, from the 14th century to the 17th century. The Europeans needed a workforce that was already suited to the tropical climate, immune to diseases, and had agricultural experience. This is all important to know because it was a tragedy in which the whole world participated, and something so inhumane as slavery should never happen again. There are three main parts to the Atlantic slave trade. They go as follows.
Africa.
The Middle Passage.
The New World.
Oh, well, I was gonna eat, but I guess talking about slavery trade in Africa is more important. Slaves were obtained by trade with African lords of royalty and were traded for goods like guns and textiles. Oloda Akinyo was an African boy and the son of a tribal leader who was stolen from his family and wrote about his experience as an autobiography. And here's a quote from that. "I believe there are few events in my life that have not happened to many," wrote Akinyo. "The many he refers to are the Africans taken as free people and then forced into slavery. They were primarily taken from the west coast, but also from inner Africa. The Europeans built around 60 forts to serve as trading posts. European sailors seeking riches brought rum, cloth, guns, and other goods to these posts and traded them for the human beings. Traders such as Irishman Nicholas Owen kept accounts of these processes."
The Middle Passage was the second part of the Atlantic slave trade. A typical ship journey was 60 to 90 days, and the ships would go from ports in Africa to different ports in the New World, in the Americas. People were stuffed below decks in places that were too low to stand. There was about 4 square feet of space per each slave. The women were usually sexually abused, and the men were shackled together to prevent mutinies. Disease spread quickly, and those who were sick were thrown overboard. There was no mercy. Before the slaves were put on ships, they were branded, so that even if they ran away, they could be identified with their ship owner. Some chose to jump overboard rather than be sold as a slave. Iron muzzles and whippings were used to control the slaves on the ships, and about 2 million people died in the crossing over the course of 3 centuries. One man, whose name is Alexander Falconbridge, was a British surgeon who took part in 4 voyages on slave ships, and gave an account on this after he became an abolitionist in 1787. Another man named John Newton was a famous slave ship captain, and he worked on slave ships in the slave trade for several years. After he converted to Christianity, he renounced his trade and became a prominent abolitionist, living to see Britain's abolition of the African slave trade in 1807. Approximately 54,000 voyages were made by Europeans to the New World with slaves. Slaves didn't have much fun on their ships, but Matt and Dirk sure do.
Slaves did work as craftsmen, sailors, and did some household chores. But as you may know, most of them worked on plantations. They worked 10 months out of the year, dawn to dusk. They often worked 48 hours straight, no rest, nothing. When sugar cane was being processed after the harvesting, the slaves had to use their bare hands to get it all out. Most of the time, they got their hands stuck in the rollers. That hurt. Ouch. The life expectancy in Brazil at the time was 23 years, so new slaves had to be brought there time and time again because they couldn't live to reproduce and make more. Slaves were used. Shoot!
I was going to take a drink, but the effects of the Atlantic slave trade are more important. There were deep social divides between rich white communities and poor black communities, particularly in the Americas. Black communities developed new identities with a combination of African, American, and European culture. And there were New World music such as hymns. Political and religious aristocrats oppressed their own people and actually kept the slave trade going strong. Many wars broke out between both tribes and nations, and as a result, they were always trading prisoner of wars for slaves. Slave trade was brutal, but it was part of everyday life. 10 million slaves sent for Oriental slave trade. There was a disproportionate number of males and females, and often left women and children homeless. Powerful Africans who engaged in slave dealing made a huge profit. Slavery was actually Africa's main export in the 18th century. It allowed Europeans to obtain raw materials such as minerals.
1502, the first slaves were taken to the New World. Following this, all the way up to 1791, the slave trade took place. In 1791 was the Haitian Revolution by blacks in Santo Domingo. In 1803, Denmark was the first nation to ban the slave trade. In 1807, Britain, the principal slave trading nation, bans the Atlantic slave trade. Also in 1807, the United States passes legislation banning slave trade that will take effect the following year. And in the 1860s, the Atlantic slave trade was abolished over a 30-year period, ending with Portugal's 1836 ban on slave trading. Following this, illegal trade took place up until the early 1900s.
Nations, and a result, they were always trading power for slaves. No, PWOS, prisoner of wars. Yeah, I messed up.
Each slave had about 4 square feet. Oh my god.
I was gonna take a drink, but the social, political, and economic effects of the Atlantic slave trade are more important.
Of the Americas, immune to diseases. Shucks!
Oh.
We're starting over.
Hold your breath and count
Get up.
10